It is a pleasure to introduce Lynn Rymarz tonight to present her senior residences and here at Church of the Holy Spirit, portraying Eleanor Roosevelt and Julia Child. In this performance, Lynn Rymarz, as Mary Todd Lincoln, will reflect on her life from her days in Springfield, Illinois, where she met and married Abraham Lincoln, became a mother to 4 sons, and then on to the White House. Well, after the emotional, tragic death of her husband, she ended up in an asylum in Batavia. As we join Mary this evening, she's just returned from a 4-year exile in France. It is my honor to introduce Mrs. Abraham Lincoln.
Thank you. I'm both pleased to be here with you tonight, with all of you Illinois ladies and gentlemen. After all, I am an Illinois lady myself. For those of you who do not know me, I am Mary Lincoln. You probably know me most as President Abraham Lincoln's wife. My husband was a good and honest man, a loving father to our 4 sons, a devoted husband of 22 years. But our life together was tragically cut short by that assassin's bullet fired that night of April 14th, 1865. We had so looked forward to happier days ahead. The Civil War of 4 years was at long last over. It had taken its toll on our divided nation, on our marriage, on our family. We had so hoped to put the painful past behind us. As Mr. Lincoln and I took a carriage ride earlier on that Good Friday before we went to Ford's Theater, he shared with me his plans for our future. The war is over, he said, and with God's blessing, we may hope for 4 years of peace and happiness. And then we will go back to Illinois, where we will pass the rest of our lives in quiet. Sadly, that was not to happen. After I descended the White House stairs for the last time, leaving behind this place that we had called home for over 4 years, I did return to Illinois with my 2 sons and tried to make a life for us here in Chicago. But my life without Mr. Lincoln by my side would never be the same. It seems like yesterday I was here in Chicago for what became that news-making event. It was May 19, 1875, 10 years after the death of my husband. It is a day that I will never forget. It is the day of my insanity trial. Why, I'm sure many of you heard of it. It was published in all of the Chicago newspapers. If I may, I would like to tell you my side of this story. I was then staying at the Chicago Grand Pacific Hotel when earlier that afternoon I received an unexpected visitor. I recognized the tall Leonard Sweat, a Chicago lawyer and a friend of my late husband. I was pleased to see him, but I apologized for the appearance of my unkept hair. He told me to never mind my hair, but to please sit down. My mind raced ahead, for I knew that when one is asked to sit down, bad news usually follows, and I was right. Mrs. Lincoln, he said, I have some bad news for you. My mind leapt to my eldest son, Robert, my only remaining son. Surely the bad news couldn't be about him, or his wife, Mary, or my precious granddaughter, Mary, or my grandson, Abraham Lincoln. Please, Lord, no, I pray, please spare me. The lawyer then told me the bad news for which he had come. Mrs. Lincoln, he said, your friends have come to the conclusion that the troubles which you have been called to pass through have been too much and have produced a mental disease. I was shocked. Lord knows I had been through a lot. First, there was the death of my 4-year-old son, Eddie, in our Springfield home. Then our precious 11-year-old son, Willie, died in the White House bedroom. Just 4 years prior to this date, our youngest son, Tad, 18 years old, died of tuberculosis right here in Chicago, leaving me once more heartbroken and devastated. Then there were all the untruths told about me from my husband's former law partner, William Herndon, a man I never trusted, a man who liked his alcohol. He went on a lecture tour and said that Mr. Lincoln never loved me, that his true love was always Anne Rutledge. Robert and I were furious to hear such lies. Then there was the old clothes scandal published about me in all the Chicago newspapers and all around the country. Not to add, I was by my beloved husband's side, holding his hand the night that he was shot at Forest Theater. For all these troubles which I had endured, this lawyer and apparently everyone else thought that I had a mental disease. You mean to say you think that I'm crazy then, do you? Yes, he answered, I regret to say. That is what your friends all think. What friends? I couldn't help but think to myself. I was well aware that ever since arriving at the White House that people had criticized me and gossiped about me. Some thought that I had eccentric behavior. I know Robert was especially concerned about this, but a mental disease? I was not about to accept this accusation, which I did not believe was true. I'm abundantly able to take care of myself. Where is my son Robert? I said. You will see him in court, he answered. I needed to discuss this accusation with my son, so I had no choice but to follow the lawyer into his waiting carriage. When we arrived at the Chicago courthouse, I discovered, to my disbelief, it was because of my son Robert that I had been summoned to stand before a 12-man jury and judge to be declared insane. The thought was unimaginable to me. I took my seat beside a court-appointed lawyer who barely spoke any words to me, for I'm sure he thought I was insane as everyone else in the courtroom that day. For the next 3 hours, I listened as 16 witnesses were called to testify against me. I recognized all of them. There was the doctor who had been treating me for my terrible migraine headaches. Because I described the pain as Indians pulling wires through my brain, he thought that I was insane. Several hotel staff members agreed. They said that I claimed I heard voices coming through the floors and through the walls of my hotel room, and that I shopped not only once, but sometimes, heaven forbid, twice a day. Another hotel staff member said that I had a closet piled full of packages which were unopened. A jewelry salesman stated that he had sold me $300 worth of jewelry. Another salesman said that he had sold me $300 worth of lace curtains, although I had no home in which to hang them in. I shook my head in disbelief as I listened to these accusations hurled against me. But the most damaging of all came from my own son, Robert, who took the witness stand. He testified that I had long been a source of anxiety, that I had been unmanageable, and I had been eccentric. With tears in his eyes, he told the court that although I had been exceedingly kind to him, that ever since the death of his father, I had been an unsound mind and irresponsible. I was not called to the witness stand, nor were there any other witnesses called to testify on my behalf. A hush went over the courtroom as the jury returned with the verdict. I remember when the foreman stood and announced, "Mary Lincoln is insane." The words still echo in my mind. My son Robert obviously got what he was after. He was awarded control of my money, and I was sentenced to be placed in an insane asylum. Before we left the courtroom that day, my handsome 31-year-old son, Robert Todd, who favored the Todd side of our family, came up to me with tears in his eyes, and I wondered how sincere he possibly could be after putting me through such a humiliating experience. I looked at him in his eyes and I said, "Robert, I did not think that you could do this to me." I was devastated. I wanted to die. The next day, Robert accompanied by train to Bellevue Place in the western town of Batavia, Illinois, a hospital for wealthy, insane women. I was to remain there however long Robert and Dr. Patterson thought that I needed to get well. My new living quarters was small, just large enough for a single bed, a bureau dresser, and a chair. I looked out of the iron-barred windows of my second-floor room where I was locked in at night. Oh, it was a far cry from that which I had been accustomed to. After all, I had served as First Lady of our United States of America, living in this White House. In this new place that I was to call home, I had lots of time to think. I was not only plotting how I was going to gain my release, for I believed I was not insane, but I had time to reflect over the 30-some years of my life and try to come to some understanding how Robert, my only remaining family member, could have so misunderstood me. But memories came flooding back. I was a devoted wife. I remember when I first met Mr. Lincoln at a dance in Springfield. Oh, how I loved going to dances, wearing my beautiful hoop-skirted dresses, attracting attention of the many eligible bachelors. I was of marrying age, and I was looking for a husband. I was courted by a number of suitors, including Stephen A. Douglas, known as the Little Giant, who became our senator here in Illinois. He and I would have made a perfect pair, for we were both short. He was active in politics, he was well-educated, had good manners, and he had a lot of money. But my heart was not drawn to him. Plus, I could never see myself marrying a Democrat. Then there was the grandson of Patrick Henry, of the fame, "Give me liberty and give me death." He and I would have made a perfect match, but my heart did not beat strongly for him. When I first met the tall Mr. Abraham Lincoln, he came up to me and said he wanted to dance with me in the worst way. Well, at the end of the evening, when I looked down at my slippers, he had indeed danced with me in the worst way. Although he was not the best dancer in the world, he was not the most handsomest of men. He did not have his best social etiquette. I did enjoy his company, and I agreed for him to call upon me again. I found that we had a number of things in common. We were both born in Kentucky. Both of our mothers died when we were quite young. Both of our fathers remarried. We both loved reading books, including books of poetry. We liked going to the theater. And we were both of the same Whig Party, the future Republican Party of America. And I loved stimulating conversation with Mr. Lincoln about political matters of the day, although it was frowned upon for a woman to discuss such things. For you see, a woman's place was in her home. Politics were for men. I would be reminded of that often from my eldest sister, Elizabeth, who I went to live with in Springfield in her mansion on the hill. As it became evident that Mr. Lincoln and I were falling in love and he asked for my hand in marriage, which of course I said yes, I learned that my sister and her husband Nidian did not approve. They said that since I was a Todd, I would be marrying beneath me, that Mr. Lincoln was of a different social background. I was raised and born in a beautiful two-story brick home. My father was a wealthy banker. He could provide for me all of my heart's desire. And I was surrounded by all of my father's many slaves, including my mammy Sally, who I became closest to after my mother died. Mr. Lincoln was born and raised in a one-room log cabin. He received very little education, 1 year's worth of formal education, whereas I had gone to boarding school and I had learned to speak fluent French. I thought that Mr. Lincoln was truly my all. He was strong. He was a rail splitter, you know. He was smart, self-educated, and he was an inventor. He had a United States patent for inventing a device which lifted boats out of the water. He was a good leader. He served as captain in the Black Hawk War. He had a good mind for politics. He was not only a lawyer, but he served with the Illinois State Legislature. And Mr. Lincoln had a good sense of humor. Once, when somebody asked him if he was two-faced, he said, "If I was two-faced, do you think that I would be wearing this face?" Well, I thought that Mr. Lincoln could provide for me a bright and a promising future. And it was our future wedding plans that I had on my mind when Mr. Lincoln broke off her engagement. For he doubted his ability to provide for me that which I had been accustomed to. But the more and more that we were apart, the more and more that we were so miserable. And we decided to secretly get married without my sister's and my brother-in-law's approval. We set the date to be married by a minister, but then my brother-in-law learned of it and said that since he was my guardian, we should get married in their home, and so we did. I was 23 years old, and Mr. Lincoln was 33 years old. On the evening of November 4th, 1842, we stood side by side in my sister's parlor. I looked up at all 6'4" tall of Mr. Lincoln. He looked down at all 5'2" short of me. Surrounded by family and friends, we promised to take each other for good times and in bad times, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death did we part. Mr. Lincoln then slipped out a gold wedding band into my finger, which she had the words engraved, "Love is eternal." We were pronounced husband and wife. I was a loving mother. 9 months almost to the date after we were married, I gave birth to our firstborn son, named him Robert Todd after my father. Mr. Lincoln and I began calling each other mother and father. We were both very proud parents indeed. What I found, living at the room that we rented at Globe Tavern, was not the most desirable place to raise a family. I was so happy when Mr. Lincoln purchased for us a small little home on the corner of 8th Street in Jackson, not far from Mr. Lincoln's law practice. We needed the growing room. For 3 years later, I gave birth to another son, named him Edward Baker, named after one of Mr. Lincoln's political friends. We nicknamed him Eddie. Owning our own home put us straight in our pocketbook, and I began counting pennies, doing much of the work myself. I sewed curtains for our windows, clothes for my sons, and dresses for myself. I cooked, I baked a special cornbread that Mammy Sally had made, and a wonderful, delicious white almond cake that Mr. Lincoln especially liked. While I not only did the cooking and the cleaning, I took care of our 2 lively boys. It was difficult for me to find good hired help around Springfield. For you see, we came from the free state of Illinois. We did not own slaves, as I had been accustomed to having in Kentucky. I had become accustomed to being both mother and father, for Mr. Lincoln was gone quite often, months at a time, as a circuit lawyer traveling around Illinois. I found it so difficult to be alone, especially during thunderstorms and when our children became sick. That was the case when our 4-year-old Eddie came down sick with fever. For 52 exhausting days, I sat by his bedside with my brother-in-law, William Wallace, the doctor, giving medicine, hoping and praying that our little boy would get well. Mr. Lincoln came and sat beside us and held his hand, but there was no medicine. There was no caregiving we could give our little boy. He died in our arms. It was a grief that we were so unprepared to handle. We did not know how could we face another day. But I had to find the strength to take care of my 7-year-old son. I believe it was by God's hands that I found that strength. 10 months later, I was blessed with another little boy. Named him William Wallace after my brother-in-law, the good doctor. We nicknamed him Willie. Oh, he was such a calm, lovable little boy. And we would have so loved to have had a little girl, but it was not to be. For 3 years later, I gave birth to another son, named him Thomas after Mr. Lincoln's father. Because of the size of his large head, and he wiggled around so much when Mr. Lincoln held him, Mr. Lincoln thought he looked like a tadpole. He nicknamed him Taddy. With our additional family members, I put a second-story addition onto our small home. I love to decorate, and I love to entertain. I hosted tea parties for our church ladies from the First Presbyterian Church. I hosted strawberry and cream parties when the strawberries were in season. I hosted birthday parties for my sons, sending invitations to the boys and girls around our town. And I hosted a special 48th birthday party for Mr. Lincoln on February 12th. On every one of Mr. Lincoln's birthday, I would say to him, "I am so glad you have a birthday. I am so grateful to your mother." Oh, our life in Springfield was so sweet, such fond memories. They were the happiest days of my life. Mr. Lincoln's law practice was doing so well that he took on another partner, William Herndon. When Mr. Lincoln would come home from work, I would find in his tall stovepipe hat all of his most important papers tucked inside. Mr. Lincoln was not the most organized man in the world, but oh, he had a mind for politics. And I believe that one day, Mr. Lincoln would become President of the United States of America. I was a supportive partner. It's not long after we put our addition onto our home, we were enjoying our home, Mr. Lincoln was elected to the United States Congress, which meant that he was gone months at a time. And so I decided to go with my sons by train to spend some time with him. But I found living at the rundown boarding house, where I was expected to keep our two lively boys quiet, I decided to take leave of Mr. Lincoln and go spend some time with my family down in Lexington. It was good to be around all of my family and around all of my father's many slaves, taking care of my many needs. But I had suddenly realized that owning slaves was wrong. They did not have their freedom. And I thought it was horrible now when I saw them sold on the auction block. Husbands and wives separated from each other, mothers and fathers separated from their children. I think my role as wife and mother made me look at slavery with new eyes, and I hated what I saw. Mr. Lincoln felt the same way. It is interesting to note that upon the death of my beloved grandmother, that she freed all of her slaves. Slavery had become a heated issue in our nation, especially when the new territories wanted to enter the Union. There was a tug between the northern states and the southern states. Mr. Lincoln believed that the new territories that entered the Union should enter as free states. But he also believed that where slavery already existed, it should remain so. Mr. Lincoln would use this thought in many of his campaign speeches. I supported Mr. Lincoln and encouraged him. When he lost in his first run to be Illinois State Senator, I encouraged him to run again. When he lost the second time against Stephen A. Douglas, Mr. Lincoln had made a name for himself, so much so that he was nominated as a Republican candidate for President of the United States of America. Hundreds of people came to hear his mighty speeches. I was so proud of the man that I had married. On November 6, 1860, Mr. Lincoln went to go cast his ballot. I would have liked to have voted for Mr. Lincoln too, but because I was a woman, I was not allowed. I do hope that one day there will be a new amendment that will allow women the right to vote in our country. That evening, Mr. Lincoln spent the time at the telegraph office waiting for the results. I waited back home with our children to see what our future would bring for us. I had fallen asleep. Mr. Lincoln came and woke me up. "Mary, Mary," he cried so excitedly, "we are elected." I couldn't wait to see what my sister Elizabeth was going to say when she learned the news that the man that she disapproved I married was about to become the 16th President of the United States of America. I was the proudest woman in our land. I was an ambitious First Lady of the White House. After we left Springfield, our home in Springfield, all our bags had been packed and sent ahead of us. We went to the railroad station. It is there that Mr. Lincoln gave a stirring speech to all of our friends and family. I have a copy of that speech. I want to share it with you. My friends, no one, not in my situation, can appreciate my feeling of sadness at this party. To this place and to the kindness of these people, I owe everything. Here I have lived a quarter of a century and have passed from a young to an old man. Here my children have been born and one is buried. I now leave not knowing when or whether ever I may return, with a task before me greater than that which reflects upon Washington without the assistance of the divine being who ever attended him. I cannot succeed. With that assistance, I cannot fail. Trusting in him who can go with me and remain with me to be everywhere for good, let us confidently hope that all will yet be well. To his care, commending you, as I hope in your prayers you will commend me, I bid you an affectionate farewell. After that farewell, we took the 12-day journey by train to our nation's capital. Thousands of well-wishers turned up along the way to cheer us on our journey. But when we reached our new home, the White House at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, we were not so well received. Washington society said that we were from the uncivilized state of Illinois. They called us uncouth country bumpkins. Can you imagine? I decided to change those. I set into shopping. You can imagine shopping on Pennsylvania Avenue and New York was such a delight. I found as the president's wife that I had clout, that I could purchase my items on credit and pay for them later. It was so much easier when I did not have to ask Mr. Lincoln for any money. And now I had my own dressmaker, a freed slave, Mrs. Elizabeth Keckley, who made for me the most stunning inauguration gown. Oh, it was just so beautiful. And Mr. Lincoln, such a romantic man, gave me a special jewelry box from Tiffany's with pearl earrings, a necklace, and a bracelet. Oh, I shook hands with all those people that day that came to the White House after the inauguration. I felt like a queen at the ball. My wardrobe soon left little for the Washington Society people to gossip about, but our new home, the White House, that was another problem. Mr. Lincoln thought it was just fine, for it was the finest home he had ever lived in. I thought the White House was in terrible condition. Why, there were holes in the carpet. There were holes in the drapes. They were ripped and torn. The furniture was badly broken. The walls were badly in need of paint. There were tobacco juice stains on the wall. I found that the basement was rat infested, and we could not even lock our front door because someone had lost the key. I learned that Congress had appropriated me $20,000 to redo the White House. This remodeling took a back seat to Mr. Lincoln, whose mind was now on the Civil War. After he had taken the oath of office, the issue over slavery had indeed divided the nation. Mr. Lincoln had long campaigned that a house divided against itself cannot stand. He vowed to preserve the Union. I vowed to redo the White House and make it a beautiful home our American people would love to come and visit. I found my shopping trips to New York were so wonderful, nothing was too good for the White House. I purchased exquisite fabric from Paris, beautiful drapes with gold-colored fringe, and stunning furniture, and also luxurious carpet. I remember I purchased an extra long, 8-foot-long rosewood bed and matching marble top table for Mr. Lincoln. I spent $1,000 on a set of red-rimmed, gold-trimmed china with the American eagle embossed in the center. Oh, my decorating took so much time, and I was so enjoying it. My children were enjoying their time also, Willie and Tad. They had new pets, a pony and 2 goats. They would hitch their 2 goats to a wagon and run up and down the halls of the White House. You can imagine what the staff members said about my children's rambunctious behavior. But Mr. Lincoln would smile and chuckle, and he would say, "It is my pleasure that my children are free and happy." Happy they were indeed. Robert came to the White House from time to time. He was going to Harvard, following in his father's footsteps to become a lawyer. We all seemed to be settling into this new chapter of our lives. Mr. Lincoln was constantly worried and distracted with the war matters, and I was keeping the White House going by finishing up the decorating. At last, the carpet was in place. The drapes were hung, the wallpaper on the walls, the paint newly painted, the furniture in order. Oh, the White House exceeded my expectations. It also exceeded my budget by $6,700. I feared, how could I pay for this? I did not want to go to Mr. Lincoln to worry him about this with all the war matters, but I knew that these had to be paid, these bills. I thought, couldn't Congress just come up with some more money for me? But when Mr. Lincoln learned of it, he said that he would have nothing to do with that he would pay it out of his own pocket. How can Congress pay for your flub dumps, he called my purchases, when our soldiers are going without blankets? I never thought of that when I was doing the redecorating. My heart was in the right place. I wanted a beautiful place that people could come and admire during this time of war. And when I held receptions, people marveled at how beautiful the White House was. But there were critics that actually also said to me that I had spent extravagantly at a time of war. Still, our White House receptions went on. I remember one special reception, we sent out 500 invitations. Well, it was February of 1862. Mrs. Keckley had made for me another stunning ball gown. All the food had been ordered, all the decorations had been hung. But on the night of this lavish ball, both my sons came down sick with fever. Of course, as their mother, I needed to cancel this event. But the doctor came and said that our sons were not in any harm's way. Still, all through that night, I steeled myself away, and I went upstairs to sit by their bedside. In the 2 weeks to follow, Mr. Lincoln and I continued to sit by their bedside, for you see, Taddy was getting well. But there was no medicine. There was no caregiving that we could give our 11-year-old boy, Willie. He died in our arms. I sunk into a depression I had never known. I could not eat. I could not sleep. I could not leave my room. His funeral went on without me. And oh, poor Mr. Lincoln, he was grieving so hard. He said our little boy was too good for this earth. I did not know how we could face another day. By God's hands, I did find the strength to go on. I was a compassionate woman. I think after the death of our son Willie, I had more empathy for the thousands of mothers across our great nations whose sons had died fighting in this war. I found comfort comforting the sick and the dying soldiers in hospitals around our nation. I brought them food from our White House pantry, flowers to help brighten their day. I sat beside many a soldier bedside, helping them write letters home to their loved ones. And I could not turn my back on the hundreds of colored men, women, and children who were fleeing the war-stricken South, finding safety in our free North. They came in masses and they built encampments. Mrs. Keckley and I went to help give them donations of blankets and food and clothing. Mr. Lincoln and I did all that we could to help them. Mr. Lincoln so wanted to rid the country of the evils of slavery that he signed the Emancipation Proclamation, stating that in January of 1863, if the Southern states did not come back into union, that all their slaves would be forever free. It was another moment that I was proud of the man that I had married. But not all of my family felt that way. For you see, my family in Kentucky were fighting in the Confederate Army. And I lost a brother, 3 half-brothers, and a brother-in-law fighting in this war. I found it difficult to grieve their losses, for you see, I had to constantly prove that I was loyal to the Union, which I was. But there were critics in the North who said that I was a Confederate spy in the White House, and Southern critics said that I was a traitor. Other critics wondered why my son Robert wasn't fighting in the Union Army. The reason was I had begged Mr. Lincoln to keep my son out of the war. I had already lost 2 sons. I could not bear the thought of losing another. But Robert had begged his father to let him join, which he got his way near the end of the war. He served as captain under General Ulysses S. Grant, which brings all those memories flooding back to me of that night of April 14, 1865. The war was nearly over. General Robert E. Lee and his Confederate Army had surrendered. The Union had been saved. Folks all over the North were celebrating this huge victory, but not everyone was celebrating. Not just one John Wilkes Booth, a Southern sympathizer who went to the presidential box during the 3rd act of the play and fired that shot, which changed my life forever. Soldiers carried Mr. Lincoln's body across the street to the Peterson house, put him in the back room in a bed that was too small, placed him diagonally across there on a pillow. Soon, President Lincoln's cabinet of men soon came in. The room was very crowded, and I knelt beside Mr. Lincoln, holding his hand, begging him to speak to me, please, to please live. But as that agonizing night drew on, and as the day of the dawn came the next day, I knew that my husband was not going to live. And a sob came over me when Robert came into the room, a sob from deep down in my soul. I couldn't contain myself. And Secretary of War Stanton ordered somebody, take that woman out of here. To think that I, his wife of 22 years, who had been by his side through all our joys and all our trials for the 22 years of our life, but he passed away at 7:22 that morning. I was not by his side. I was escorted back to the White House. I could not stop crying. My son, 13-year-old son, Tad, would come into the room and say, Mama, please stop crying. But I couldn't. My poor son without a father, me without a husband. And I heard the pounding of the carpenters from the East Room below me who were making the platform to put President Lincoln's coffin and body for the thousands of mourners that would come and pay their respect to their fallen leader, the great emancipator. I could not go to the funeral. I did not leave my room. The only thing I knew is that our son Willie was going to be by his father's side in the funeral car on their way back to Springfield, where he would be buried by his father in Oak Ridge Cemetery in Springfield. I received hundreds of condolences, and one reached me from Queen Victoria from England. She understood how I felt. Dear Madam, though a stranger to you, I cannot remain silent when so terrible calamity has fallen upon you and your country, and must personally express my deep and heartfelt sympathy with you under the shocking circumstances of your dreadful misfortune. No one can better appreciate than I can who I am myself utterly brokenhearted by the loss of my own beloved husband, Albert, who was the light of my light, my stay, my all. What your sufferings must be, and I earnestly pray that you may be supported by him to whom alone the sorely stricken can look for comfort in this hour of heavy affliction. With the renewed expression of true sympathy, I remain, dear Madam, your sincere friend, Victoria. Like her, I would be without my husband. I would now be a widow. A month after Mr. Lincoln had died, I then left the White House with all of my 50 boxes and my belongings that we had taken there. Hardly anyone bid us a farewell. I was now a widow. And it was difficult for me, for you see, I had to fight and petition Congress to give me Mr. Lincoln's pension, which would take years to get. And because Mr. Lincoln died without leaving a will, it would take several years for that to be settled. It would even be divided between my sons and myself. And there was the debt from all my shopping sprees that I had kept secret, that no one knew about. Now there were creditors that were coming and wanting to be paid. How was I to pay them? I didn't want people to know that I owed this money. Above all, I couldn't tell my son Robert. Mrs. Keckley came with me to Chicago. We decided that we could sell all those beautiful dresses that she had made for me and the jewelry. For you see, I no longer wore them. I only wore mourning black, just like Queen Victoria did. And we had a plan. There was an auction that could be held in New York, a quiet auction. No one would know it was me. And we brought our trunks with all of the things that was very discreet. But somehow, word was linked that these were Mrs. Lincoln's clothes. It was published in all the country's newspapers. It was called the Old Clothes Scandal. Robert was so embarrassed. I think it was the beginning of him thinking of me to be of unsound mind and why he would have me declared insane. But I was not insane. Yes, I agreed with the doctors when they had given me chloral hydrate. I did have hallucinations because the sleeping powder caused that in me. People would think I was crazy. And I did agree with the lawyer, Leonard Swett, that day when he said that the troubles which I had been called to pass through had been too much, but they had not produced a mental disease. I was of such sound mind that those 4 months that I was at Bellevue Place, I secretly mailed letters off to Mrs. Myra Bradwell, the first woman lawyer in Illinois, and she paid me a visit. She thought that I was no more insane than she was. She campaigned for me to have a second trial. After those 4 months, Leonard Swett, the lawyer who had taken me the first time, represented me. Now, my brother-in-law, Nidian Edwards, he was a witness that I was not insane. When the jury returned the verdict that Mary Lincoln is restored to reason, I was most grateful and gratified. I went now to live with my sister Elizabeth in Springfield, where neither she nor Nidian, my brother-in-law, thought that I was insane. It was good to be around their loving arms and their support. But you can imagine, can't you, how bitter I was against my son Robert for putting me through such a humiliating ordeal. After I got back to Springfield, I wrote Robert a letter. I said, send me all that I have asked for. See, I was so generous with all the gifts that I had sent him and his families. I said, you have tried your game of robbery long enough. You have injured yourself, not me, by your wicked conduct. I normally would have signed my letter, lovingly mother. I signed it, Mrs. A. Lincoln. I was now known as a crazy woman. I found that everywhere I went in Springfield, I felt people staring at me. I saw them pointing at me. I saw them whispering behind my back. I knew that they were saying, there goes Mary Lincoln, the crazy woman. I could not live in Springfield or anywhere else in America for that matter. I decided to go to France, where I could speak the language fluently and where no one knew who I was. Before I left, I told my sister, Elizabeth, I cannot endure to meet my former friends. They will never cease to regard me as a lunatic. I've now since returned from my 4-year exile in France. I returned from Paris with a new hat. Do you like it? The latest of fashions. I feel a woman can never have too many hats. I come back a more slender woman. I'm 100 pounds now. And I come back a forgiving mother. I enjoy spending time with Robert and my 3 grandchildren, Mary, Abraham, and Jesse. And I am proud of the man that Robert has become, following in his father's footsteps as a lawyer, spending days in the White House as the Secretary of War under President James Garfield. Of course, I pray for his safety and his well-being during the times that he is serving. As for myself, I've studied days at my sister's home in Springfield, where I had spent that time with Abraham Lincoln. I have some 65 trunks and boxes that I have in the house that I rummage through and look at all the beautiful things, and my granddaughters like to cut out some of my dresses and make little purses out of them. But mostly I recall that day when Abraham and I stood side by side in my sister's parlor, and he gave me that beautiful ring with the words that he had engraved, love is eternal. I know without a shadow of a doubt that I will be reunited with my loved one, Abraham Lincoln, for I do know that love is eternal. Thank you so much for sharing with me my story. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your performance, Lynn. It was very engaging.
Thank you.
And I do think that this is going to be an inspiration for all of us this evening.
Oh,
and I
thank
hope
you. I didn't think about
all of
that.
our viewers feel the same way. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. God bless you all.